Who is to blame if the leader can never be wrong? Welcome everyone to another episode of the Mere Mortals Book Reviews. You've got Kyron here coming live from Brazil on the 12th of September 2024. And as you might surmise, this is the podcast where I profess my deep love of the socialist systems, of communism, and of the great leader himself, Chairman Mao. No, I'm not going to be doing that. But you'll probably see a little bit of that in this book that we have today, which is Mao's Great Famine by Frank Dikötter. This book was published in 2010, so it's actually a bit more recent than I would normally review, but this is a history book. So it's 448 pages. Probably took me about 12-ish hours of reading to get through, I believe. Now, I'm just going to read the subtitle here because I think that explains it perfectly. The History of China's Most Devastating Catastrophe, 1958 to 62. Okay, it's a pretty good subtitle in terms of things. So he really dives into statistics from recently opened archives. And it's a mixture of horrific stories with or without corroboration. It's kind of hard to tell with some of these things. So these would be actual stories from the archives. And then I believe some of these people he's interviewed himself, or he's had graduates or people working under him interview from that time period, 1958 to 62. As well as the political context of the time, so what was happening with the People's Republic of China, as it was known then, and why this wasn't just a natural occurrence, why this famine actually had some originations in the real world with leaders making decisions, and this proliferating down to the poor country folk who, of course, were the ones affected by the famine and never the people at the top. So you'll learn in this book a lot about agricultural methods. I didn't think I'd be learning that much about rice paddies and the structure of China and cultural phenomena that occurred in this time, but you did. You'll learn about the Great Leap Forward, which is what precipitated all of this, and some personal stories of heartbreaks, mountain of statistics, etc., etc. Let's get into the actual themes of the book. Now, I've got two here, and I'm really going to just call them era, methodical, and cultural, or methodological, maybe is probably a better way of putting it. So I think that right at the start here, I just want to establish some of the facts, some pretty indisputable facts that were brought up in this book. And these are things without contention, I believe, and which really just highlight what happened during that time. So first of all, 30 to 45 million people died, with the majority of this being from famine. In the book himself, Frank Dikötter is pushing more for the 45 million range. I believe the general consensus is probably closer to the 30-ish or 30 to 40. So that this is something that he's pushing the boundary. In any case, a whole lot of people died. I believe the population at the time of China didn't result this as a percentage being as high as something like the famine that was occurred in Ukraine or something like that. I believe it was like 3% of the population, something like that. Maybe even a little bit less, 1 to 2%. In any case, a still staggering number of lives. The average yearly tonnage per person plummeted, which makes sense. It was like there's not enough food to go around, so this is why all of these people died, or the vast majority of them were dying from famine. In the book, he believes 1 to 3 million were from kind of like a political repression as well, so this being targeted torture, killings of people who were against the CCP, the Chairman Mao and the party itself. I don't believe it was called the CCP at the time, PRC. And so this would be a majority of them as well were old and infirm people, and even some defenseless people like children and babies. Now, a couple of other things that happened: 30% or more of housing was destroyed for raw material, and they would use this raw material to either build roads, or because some of the houses were made of this kind of like dung. And remember, we're talking 1958 China in the rural countryside, so we're imagining like basically peasant houses and things like this. A lot of these houses were made from like dung and stuff like that, and these were deconstructed and used for fertilizer in this big regime of the Great Leap Forward to progress things forward. I'll talk about that soon. and iron and things like this. Cooking utensils were burnt down to make iron ingots. There was huge intentional dislocations of people for drainage projects. So they tried to, divert the Yellow River, I believe it's called, the Yangtze, and divert this or make side streams, create dams, which were supposedly to, make agricultural projects work better, to have proper drainage, to all of these sorts of things. So a lot of people were forced to work on these things. So farmers and people who were merchants and sellers became, laborers. And then there was also unintentional people of fleeing the countryside, going towards the cities, because that was typically where there was more food, or they were fleeing to other countries like Hong Kong, into Tibet and other places like that. The other undisputable thing was Chairman Mao was the indisputable leader, and the Great Leap Forward was the main political push of these years. So the Great Leap Forward was, okay, we've now become like a communist state. We've risen to power. They've overthrown, the political system that was in China before, and now we really need to modernize. We need to catch up to the Soviets, for example. We've got, however many 100 million people in this country, and we need to revolutionize and really just become a world leader. It's essentially what Chairman Mao wanted to do. And so there was these big political pushes to change the countryside and make the country great, essentially. So this is the context of everything. I think those were the pretty indisputable facts. Then we get into some of the errors that we see. And so you don't have a man-made catastrophe of, 30 to 45 million people dying without a lot of disruption of the status quo. So what we did see of the man-made changes that were occurring were things like close cropping and overseeding of farmland, of rice paddies and things like this, which ended up leading to poor production. We saw farmers being forced to produce pig iron because they needed more iron ingots and things like this, which basically ended up in these useless iron ingots that were of such poor quality that nobody could use. We saw there was these eliminating of pigeons. There was a big purge of pigeons, which invariably ended up in a huge locust infestation that ate a lot of crops as well. We saw a lot of diverting of rivers and clearing of forests, which ended up contributing to flooding and droughts. We saw communal living with no property rights, which ended up being these abject conditions where people were living in these houses where, there was one toilet which was continually overflowing. They would use, dirty water from the river to cook rice in and things like this. And we also saw this really strict hierarchy, which ended up in cadres. So these were the kind of members of the party who were overseeing all of the projects, who were organizing the people in the peasants in the townships, and essentially forcing them to follow the party line. And they would continually inflate numbers to their bosses about production, about how things were going. And so we could see there was a bit of a distortion of the truth going on. Now, some of this stems from bad ideas. It was a bad idea to put children back into the workforce as well, and to have, females being forced to work in the most abject of conditions, men being forced to work in the just straight up, basically cold winter snow without any protection. It's like, do you think you're going to have much productivity going on? No, not really. Some of this was from poor implementation. So workers themselves, when they realized there was no way to get forward, there was no property rights, the results of their labor didn't end up in good things happening to them, i.e. the harder you work, the more you get, or the more you can save, or the better life you can have. When they realized this happened, it was like, well, why should I work hard? And in fact, I'm going to not work hard so I can preserve some energy, because there's a whole lot of famine coming along. We saw some unknowable info, such as the Soviet and geopolitical changes of other countries around them forcing China to react in different ways. And so there was unknowable things, unexpected changes. There was some, some of this occurred from unhelpful cultural relics from the past. So, you would have superstitions of yokels, of peasants who still had ties to an old way of perhaps, we always plant our crops like this, and we always follow these sort of rituals and things like this, which might have been against the current best practices of science at the time, or things like this. We probably we did see some genuine bad luck. There was bad adverse conditions weather-wise that contributed to the famine for sure. We saw there was probably a little bit from treason as well. So Kuimo, I believe is how that's pronounced or how it's said, which is the equivalent of the Soviet wreckers. So these were the people who were intentionally trying to make the state fall apart by not destroying projects or making sure that things didn't work. So a lot of this all occurs at the same point. So this is why it's not easy to just go like, they planted the wrong crops and this is why the famine occurred. No. There was a portion of that was from them trying to plant different crops in different areas, and areas which were renowned for this one type of crop were forced to then put a new type of crop in, which they'd never used before. So the farmers didn't really know what they were doing. They didn't know how to produce this, which of course ends up in lower productivity overall. So I think there's kind of some of this is to be expected and almost forgiven in a sense. There's no way to control the genuine adverse weather effects. There's no real way of knowing like exactly, okay, we want to do a new experimental crop system. We're going to try this out, and this will either succeed or it won't succeed. Or perhaps they did try an experimental one on a particular piece of land. It worked, and it's like, okay, let's roll this out in a bigger proportion. I think it's forgivable in a sense, because implementing change is really hard. You assume that these people were trying to make the world a better place for the Chinese, and this is what Mao wanted. He wanted the Chinese economy to be bigger. He wanted everyone to have food in their belly. And we can see that there was an acknowledgement as well on his part where it was, they called it the 9 fingers. So in implementing the change, they recognize, okay, the 9 fingers, there's going to have to be one finger which suffers because the way they were trying to push things forward is there's someone's going to have to suffer at some point. And if the one is suffering for the 9, that's an acceptable compromise that we can reach. So there was acknowledgement that, hey, we're implementing big changes in this great leap forward. There's going to be some suffering. There's going to be, some hardships, but it's for the greater good. The greater good would be the thing here. And we see this, businesses fail all the time for similar causes. They kind of understand market conditions. They have a really great product, but the timing is not right, perhaps. The people aren't ready for it. They're let down by suppliers elsewhere in the chain of how they construct this product. This happens all the time. The reasons, now what typically happens is reasons for non-success can be identified. Perhaps another go at this can be had, and some culpability assigned. It's like, all right, these are the people who stuffed up. I'm not going to use these suppliers anymore. I'm not going to trust this person anymore because they've proven that they are incapable of working and creating the product that we want or doing the things that we need. We can learn from our mistakes and do better. So this is kind of like the the error in methodology. They tried to put something in place and it failed. And the failures were from the result of trying, and those are the ones I'm like, okay, you can kind of understand that even though there's still things wrong with what they were doing, it's kind of human error as well. We can kind of forgive that. The unforgivable portion, I think, is more the cultural error, and so this is where I argue that much like a company, the internal culture of a nation is what drives whether it ultimately wins or succeeds. So if you have a business, for example, and your only goal is to make money, and you set your salespeople out in the world and they lie through their teeth to get sales, they promise things of a product which isn't ever going to happen, you're going to see like this company can maybe get a short-term boost, but ultimately they're going to fail because the internal culture is misaligned to the betterment of humanity and betterment of that company itself. It's really short-term thinking. And so what we see with China during this period was it was all top-down. So Chairman Mao was revered. There was no true contest of his power. There was, in the book, he mentioned some small power games by, other people who were high up in the ranks. But honestly, I got the feeling that he was pretty much indisputably in charge, and what he said was revered. And if he wanted the Great Leap Forward to happen, it would happen even if other people were like, I'm not sure we're ready to, really revolutionize the countryside like this. I don't know if we should do it this quickly. It didn't really matter. And so people would enact his words. And the problem with this was he was intentionally vague a lot of the time. He'd be slippery with his words. He'd be sometimes contradictory. And so he could be mysterious and aloof as well. So when he decided in, I'm guessing like 1957, 1958, hey, we're going to do this Great Leap Forward, the plans for this reformation spread downward. He was the one pushing it forward. So we really do have it. This wasn't just a groundswelling of support from, the individual peasant on the ground who's like, yo, we need to make China better. Let's do all of these things. It was from the top down. So boiling down the famine into its simplicity, because that's what this book is about, Mao's Great Famine, China produced less grain, yet somehow exported more during these years. So in particular, from the kind of like 1958 to 61, we saw that the average tonnage per person, so the list of actual grain and materials and production from these provinces went down. So let's say you just pick like a random province like Wuhan or that's the only one I really know. I'm not good with Chinese names. Let's say they were at like 120 tons per year. We would routinely see numbers in the book of it dropping down to 80 tons and then perhaps to 40 tons. So a ridiculous decrease in production. Some areas wouldn't be as bad, but I didn't really get the sense that anywhere increased production, that all of these attempts to make things more productive actually resulted in more productivity. It always seemed to go down. So we see these tonnages dropping and you're like, okay, well, obviously China's not going to be exporting as much because they're not producing as much. Yet the actual numbers exported from China to the rest of the world rose. And so you're going like, well, how could they be exporting more but producing less? And what we see is that the exports that they promised kept rising, what they were producing kept going down, and so we'd see that the grain as a percentage available to feed their own people was getting squeezed in this middle bit until the point where it was basically margin thin. And so this is what resulted from the average tonnage of what people could eat prior to 1958 compared to near the end in 1961 and 1962 was that they were essentially eating nothing. 100 grams of some sort of grain per day, which is starvation diet. You're barely going to survive on this. So they had these epidemics of edema, and this is typically the images you see where they've got the swollen belly with carrying a lot of water weight. Their skin would kind of be watery in general, so you could poke it and it would kind of hold it this shape, this indent, because there was just so much water in the skin, it would leak out of them at times. And all of this was a result of systematic distortion of statistics. And so the cadres were saying, yeah, everything's more productive, everything's good, like let's go. The people are well fed, we can give you more grain because everything's so much more productive. The reason they did this was because they did not want to receive white flags, which was bad in the Chinese system at the time, but red flags were good. It's kind of funny how that inversion happens compared to modern day, where red flags are seen as a bad thing. Perhaps it actually came from that, who knows. And they would do anything to keep the lie going. So this really resulted in people eating leaves, in dirt, in bark, coal, and there's some reported cases of cannibalism. Not, of course, that's very sensational, so that seems to get stories of like, oh, there was so much. There didn't really appear to be that much, and certainly it wasn't really people killing other people to eat them. It was more exhuming dead bodies in the ground to perhaps eat them. But even then, I think most people would rather starve than do that, which ended up happening. A lot of people ended up starving and dying. So all of this, it's like there's so many things I want to relate and tell and say, like, okay, this happened as well. Here's some stories of people who had to, change where their location was based, of where they argued against the cadres and they were just beaten senseless. Of when bad things like famine are happening, it multiplies the badness everywhere. There used to be all of these markets where people would come together and sell things. That was outright banned, but there was an underground version of it, which was kind of tolerated because the party also knew, like, okay, well, we have to kind of keep this going, otherwise people really will starve and there will be an outbreak of like revolution again and things like this. All of these sorts of things. So what were the areas? Here's a couple that I came from this, which are more the cultural side. You cannot suddenly break cultural systems and expect long-term success. They really tried to break down the family unit. They tried to break down people's typical jobs, of how villages worked. They tried to enforce these new communal systems. And whilst you might get a short-term boost of productivity in whatever, you just say to people, hey, you're going to now work 16-hour days instead of 12-hour days. You're gonna get and force them to do it. You're gonna get a little bit of productivity, and if you've got the whip and you're forcing them to do it, sure, that might help in the short term. But obviously, that's not gonna last. People will stop working. People will die. Productivity is not just a simple measure of work harder. There's a lot of other things that go into that, and you need to be well fed. You need to have clothing. You need to enjoy what you're doing, and there didn't seem to be much enjoyment going on during these periods. So that was one of the big cultural errors. Another one, keeping the same mentality of revolution after becoming powerful. So Chairman Mao was not the chairman once. He was just a political fighter, guerrilla fighting in the outskirts, who eventually managed to take over China. And a lot of the people who were in his, revolutionary fighting, literally in the jungles and shit like this, they remained in power. And yet, if you treat civilians in a kind of military context, it's not necessarily going to work. And there probably was, if you're doing like a broad stereotype of these types of people, they're probably people who are willing to be more fighters and be more violent and use violence to achieve their aims, which is kind of what you see in this book as well. When people were not working hard enough, violence was the answer. There was not much carrot and there was a lot of stick. So this was a cultural error. No boots on the ground. If you know that everyone is lying, the only way to verify it with anything is with your own eyes. This is where people might argue, oh, but Chairman Mao didn't know because his subordinates were lying to him. There was just lies all the way through. And it's like, yeah, sure, but he encouraged this sort of system. He knew enough to know that people were lying, that there was reports were not necessarily to be trusted, yet he did nothing about it himself personally to fix this. And so the only times that we really see people who are realizing like just how bad it was were upper members of the party when they get a message from their hometown saying like, we're all dying here, and they're going, well, what do you mean? Like, the statistics say everything is good. And then they'll actually go there and see the people dying in the streets, the mass graves, or, you know, of the side, if anyone even had the energy left to dig a grave for someone. So a ridiculous amount of suffering going on there. And only a few people did this. Only a few people really went out to the countryside and said like, oh shit, there's a lot of famine going on in here. And it was predominantly the countryside, because the cities were made sure to still get enough grain. So, or if they did, it was certainly more than the people in the countryside did. And then the final error, and probably one of the bigger ones, is an infallible leader or a system means no course correction. So there was times where they actually knew, hey, we can't keep doing this. These people are just producing these iron ingots that are useless. And instead of it being like a whoa, let's stop, let's change things. Typically, the system of fixing this would be to just kind of pretend it never happened, and then gradually it'll be a soft shift instead of a radical like, hey, bad things are happening, we need to fix this immediately. And so blame would shift to the sycophant, Zhou Enlai, who was kind of second in charge. He was the one who'd say, like, it's all my fault. Anything that went wrong, you know, it wasn't Chairman Mao's fault. It was my fault. I'd take the responsibility. And he would remain in second in charge because Chairman Mao needed someone who would take the blame. But no really remedies or course correction were put in place in reaction to information. And so not only was the information distorted, but when it became undeniable that there was a famine, the Chinese policy didn't change. They still exported grain at a ridiculous rate to other countries to fulfill obligations for political reasons, for money reasons, whatever. They voluntarily gave, this is the craziest thing, they voluntarily gave grain to other poor nations who were suffering, even though their nation was suffering more. They refused grain from other countries such as the US, and even I believe from the Soviets, who they had good communications with, because it was you know, it would have been a posturing thing. We can't accept, like, we can't accept that we have made mistakes and we have screwed up so badly that our own people are dying. We're going to pretend it never happened, and, you know, we're better than your handouts to us. Like, we're the great Chinese nation. We're not, you know, impoverished poor people or anything like that. Yet at the same time having millions of their people dying. So just really sad. And I think a lot of this cultural blame is put on, you know, if this was a groundswelling of support and it was just a collective decision of the people, hey, the Great Leap Forward, we're going to attempt this, and it didn't work out and a lot of people died, you know, you could put a little bit of blame on everyone. But in this case, man, like, Chairman Mao was the one who really pushed this forward, and the whole party pushed it forward as well. And I think a lot of the blame resides on him and on the party and the leadership of the country during that time for the deaths of 30 to 45 million people. So, hard. Let's jump on to the author and perhaps some extra details. Mr. Dikötter, Frank Dikötter, is a Dutch historian, as you would expect with a name like that. He has written a lot about China. I think he's got 14 books or so. And this one itself is part of a trilogy related to the cultural, the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, and then I think there was another one from before that. It was like Tragedy of Liberations or something like that. So he's written a lot of books. He's pretty good at what he does, and it's obviously his specialty. Similar to the themes, I think there's a kind of two errors that perhaps might creep into this book while you're reading it, so just good to be aware of. It's a highly disputed and controversial subject, so there's always going to be people on either sides saying, and it's got that political tinge to it as well, so you know there's going to be people arguing about this or that. I think he does a decent job at trying to minimize the measurement and statistic errors. As we already know, everyone was lying, so it's like, well, how does he have any statistics to put in this book? And if he does, they're just bullshit, so what's the point? There actually were kind of like internal statistics, so there was the ones published, which perhaps were the ones that were out to the media and things like this, and then this would spread to the greater world and public at large. But there was also series of internal statistics which perhaps were a bit closer to the truth, and then there was another series, so there was like 2 to 3 variations, all with contradictory figures between the lines of the reported party stats and what actually happened. So I think he does a pretty decent job of explaining, like, this is how I went about doing it. I'm aware of these things. I obviously have no idea how he actually went about doing it, how he went about sampling, because obviously these aren't consensus. Every Chinese person was accounted for. This is why you get these huge variations in the numbers of deaths and also in the tonnages produced and things like this. So I think he does a pretty good job from what he wrote in the book and how he went about his methodology of doing this. I think let's just go with the numbers that he produces, and I think he does a decent job of that. The cultural errors are perhaps that some people claim he's not being objective enough and is putting too much blame on the PRC and on the leadership and on Mao himself. I'm less inclined to humor this, and I just say this because I've read some articles and some people talking about this book. I've seen similar things written about Stalin along these lines, like, how could he have known about the Holodomor? How could he have known about this? And he was getting fed lies from. It was actually the real bad guy was the third in command or the seventh in command, and it's like, they're the ones. It's very top down. So you got to put some blame on these people for. Whilst it was true that everybody lied, he was also the leader. If he wanted to know the truth, he could have demanded it. He could have made sure that these things happened, that he would have known about what was really happening. So any cultural errors in terms of biases in the book, if there is, I think it's minimal personally, but I wasn't alive during that time, so who frickin' knows. Let's jump on to the summary, similar books, recommendations. It's really hard to capture everything I wanted to talk about this. So there's a pretty long review that I've done already, but I feel like I could have kept going onwards. There was all sorts of just interesting, very sad things that came up in this book, and I feel like I've done a disservice by not mentioning the intricacies of why this county got affected this way, how some smaller places managed to avoid the famine a lot, how the actual cultural and how the political party worked in general. And there's a lot to get from this. As you're reading it, it kind of feels like it's a bit monotonous. You're like, damn, all right, this keeps on going. Like, he's going on about more deaths, and now he's talking about deaths related to suicide. Now he's talking about deaths related to the famine. Now he's talking about deaths related to actual torturing and grain production. And you're like, oh god, this is a bit much. But then at the end, you're like, damn, I learned a fair bit about China during 1958 to 1962. So it's a very sad period. Overall, I'm giving the book a 6.5 out of 10. It's kind of a harsh rating in the sense that how he actually wrote it, the book itself, the statistics, I think is good, but it's just on such a sad theme that it's not like it's really enjoyable. This is more about how I felt after it. I'm like, yeah, I feel like a 6.5 out of 10 are reading this book. There was a lot of interesting history. I think puts a lot of things in perspective, but also doesn't particularly make me feel good. And it's like, it's hard to read about these things. Similar books. It's similar in vein to Simon Sebag's Montefiere's The Quarter of the Red Tsar. That's probably the closest equivalent type history book I've read, where it's relatively dry, but he gives enough anecdotal information to make it interesting as well. The small touches of humanity to break through the statistics. In this book itself, there wasn't really any charts. It was more here's how these stats went, which, I think a chart or two here to really show the grain production and stuff like that would be helpful, but it's not highly necessary as well, because I think the information he provides, you could create a chart from it yourself if you wanted to. So, that's the book here, the Frank Dikötter's Mao's Great Famine. Brutal, very brutal. Let's jump on to the value for value section here. So this is a value for value podcast where I put all of this value up to you up front. You should be able to get this anytime, any place, anywhere, without any advertising, without any sponsorships. No one is really influencing the books that I read, and I'm reading these because I enjoy them and because I want to read them. And there's quite a few ways that you can contribute back to this. I put it all out for free, myself and one, and we just ask that you either share the podcast with someone, that you give me some book recommendations, that you write a comment on the YouTube channel on the latest book review, what you thought of it, things like this. And you can also support us monetarily, which a couple of people have done this week, which is really, really awesome. So coming in right at the top, we have Peter. He says, a great description of a philosopher personality type, a smart person who doesn't really fit in any other field. Yeah, what a disappointing journey into the world of philosophy. It feels almost like hours of digging through the muck to find a few nuggets of truth, of which you probably knew intuitively anyways, but just never verbalized. Oh well. And so that was 2,222 sats sent using the Fountain app, which is where you can help support the podcast and write a message at the same time. So thank you very much for that, Peter. Yeah, definitely. Like I said, I know I'm going to go back to philosophy at some point in the future. And when I say philosophy, I mean like the classical type ones. Think Spinoza, Kant, Hume. I've yet to read any of them. I know I'm going to try them at some point, but it's going to be rare and set apart. And I know I'm most likely going to get disappointed, but I feel like I've got to do it. It keeps on drawing me back in. So we have that one, and then we have another one. This might be a first as well for first-time booster, which is Queen Mother. She says, thank you. You've encouraged me to get back to this. I started a book in Spanish about a year ago, and it fell to the wayside. I like your idea of writing it down. I think that will help me. 102 sats sent using Fountain as well. Thank you, Queen Mother. So that is the Queen Mother of the Dorfels. And I'm guessing, I couldn't actually find the book she was referencing there in general. I'm imagining it's like an old, it could be one of Juan's, like the Little Prince that he read recently, because he read that in another language, or it could be a very old one of mine, related to perhaps, I don't know, Gabriel Garcia Marquez or any of the Latin American boom period authors, which I have done. So if you want to be like Peter or Queen Mother, meremortalspodcast.com/support is the way to go. And I've got an explanation there of how you can help support us. There's also a PayPal link down below. So thank you everyone for doing that. Let's jump on to the final section here. Just a mention that I'm live here on the podcasting apps. I'm also live on YouTube, so if you ever do feel like joining in, I would love to have you join us. And you can write some comments and things like that, and I will read them out at the end here. I can never guarantee exactly what time. I know next week I'll be around the same time, 10 a.m. Brazilian Standard Time. Brasilia Standard Time. And then in the future, I'll be in New Zealand for a little bit, then I'll be back in Australia. So there's going to be, who knows, one might do a book review here or there. And yeah, we've got I'll still be doing these live in the future. Got a fair few books coming up. The ones which I know for sure is Crossing the Chasm by Geoffrey Moore, Capitães da Areia by Jorge Amado, which is a book I read in Portuguese. So that will be the next one. And then I've also reading at the book, the sketchbook of Jeffrey Crayon by George Washington Irvine, something like that. And Marshall McLuhan's Understanding Media. So quite a lot coming up in the future. I really hope you're looking forward to these. And we'll leave it there for today. It's a big one. Now, thank you for joining in for this long one. History books are kind of fun like that, and they get me excited, and there's a lot to talk about. So that's it for today. Ciao for now. Kyron out.